In the autumn of 1856, in the remote hills of Barren County, Kentucky, Dr. William Hayes documented what he would later call the most extraordinary and terrifying medical phenomenon he had ever encountered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 4 identical children, born on the same October night during a violent thunderstorm, would challenge everything the medical community thought they understood about human development, consciousness, and the very nature of life itself. What Dr. Hayes discovered about the Whitmore quadruplets was so disturbing, so far beyond the accepted boundaries of 19th century science, that his colleagues demanded he destroy his research. When he refused, they made sure his findings would never see the light of day. The truth about Sarah, Mary, Elizabeth, and Catherine Whitmore reveals a medical mystery so profound that even today, more than 150 years later, no scientific institution will acknowledge what really happened in that isolated Kentucky farmhouse. The story begins with a man whose dedication to medical science would ultimately cost him everything. Dr. William Hayes had arrived in Bowling Green, Kentucky in 1854, fresh from his studies at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. At 28 years old, he possessed the kind of relentless curiosity that drove him to question accepted medical wisdom and seek answers where others saw only mystery. Hayes had chosen to practice in rural Kentucky not for wealth or prestige, but because he believed that isolated communities might harbor medical phenomena that had never been properly documented or studied. The Whitmore family lived on a tobacco farm 15 miles northeast of Bowling Green, in a valley so remote that their nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Jonathan Whitmore had built his homestead in 1851, bringing with him his young wife Margaret, and dreams of establishing a prosperous farm in Kentucky's fertile soil. Margaret Whitmore was known throughout Barren County for her gentle nature and deep religious faith. She had suffered 3 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage, losses that had driven her to spend long hours in prayer and left her husband, Jonathan, wondering if they would ever have the children they so desperately wanted. When Margaret finally conceived again in early 1856, the pregnancy seemed different from the start. She grew larger much faster than expected, and by her 5th month, Dr. Hayes suspected she might be carrying twins. By her 7th month, he was certain she was carrying at least 3 children, possibly 4. Multiple births were extremely rare in 1856, and Dr. Hayes found himself both excited by the medical opportunity and concerned about the complications that such a birth might bring. The night of October 15, 1856, brought one of the most violent storms in recent Kentucky memory. Lightning split the sky with unusual frequency, and thunder rolled across the hills with such intensity that it shook the windows of homes for miles around. Margaret Whitmore went into labor just as the storm reached its peak, and Jonathan rode through the dangerous weather to fetch Dr. Hayes from town. The journey that normally took an hour stretched to nearly 3 as Hayes navigated muddy roads, made treacherous by the driving rain and frequent lightning strikes. When Dr. Hayes finally arrived at the Whitmore farmhouse, he found Margaret in the advanced stages of a labor that had progressed with unusual speed. What followed was unlike any birth he had attended in his medical career. The first child, later named Sarah, emerged during a particularly violent lightning strike that lit up the entire room. Mary followed 20 minutes later, during another flash of lightning that seemed to illuminate her pale features with an otherworldly glow. Elizabeth arrived as thunder crashed overhead with such force that the cabin's foundation trembled. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine, the final child, was born at the exact moment when the storm reached its most intense point, as if nature itself was marking the significance of her arrival. All 4 children were identical in every visible way. They shared the same pale blonde hair, the same unusually light blue eyes, and the same delicate features that marked them unmistakably as sisters. Each child weighed exactly the same amount, measured the same length, and displayed identical physical characteristics down to the smallest detail. Dr. Hayes had never seen such perfect uniformity among multiple birth siblings, and his initial excitement at documenting this remarkable case was tempered by a growing sense that something about these children was not quite natural. The first indication that the Whitmore quadruplets were different came within hours of their birth. While most newborns cry frequently and require constant attention, Sarah, Mary, Elizabeth, and Catherine remained remarkably quiet. They seemed to sleep in perfect synchronization, waking and sleeping at exactly the same moments, despite being placed in separate cribs. When one child needed feeding, all 4 would wake simultaneously and demand nourishment. When one became fussy, the others would mirror her distress within seconds. Dr. Hayes initially attributed this behavior to the natural bond between siblings who had shared the womb for 9 months. However, as he continued to observe the children during their first weeks of life, he began to notice patterns that defied medical explanation. The quadruplets seemed to share not just behavioral synchronization, but something far more profound and unsettling. Margaret Whitmore was the first to notice what she described as the children's unusual awareness. Unlike typical newborns who focus primarily on basic needs like feeding and sleeping, the quadruplets seemed to study their surroundings with intense concentration. Their pale blue eyes would track movement around the room with precision that seemed advanced for their age. More disturbing still was the way they would stare at each other across their separate cribs, maintaining eye contact for extended periods, as if engaged in some form of silent communication. Jonathan Whitmore, a practical man not given to flights of fancy, found himself deeply unsettled by his daughter's behavior. He confided to Dr. Hayes that he often felt as though the children were watching him, studying him with an intelligence that seemed far beyond their weeks of age. When he worked in the barn, he would sometimes catch sight of 4 small faces pressed against the farmhouse window, their identical pale eyes following his every movement with unblinking attention. Dr. Hayes began visiting the Whitmore farm twice weekly, ostensibly to monitor the health of the quadruplets, but actually to document their unusual development. His medical journal from this period reveals a growing fascination mixed with mounting concern about what he was observing. The children continued to develop in perfect synchronization, reaching every milestone at exactly the same moment. When Sarah first smiled, all 4 children smiled simultaneously. When Mary first rolled over, her 3 sisters performed the identical movement within seconds. By their 3rd month, the quadruplets had begun displaying behaviors that Dr. Hayes found impossible to explain using accepted medical knowledge. They would cry in perfect harmony, creating complex musical patterns that seemed too sophisticated for infant vocalizations. Their movements became increasingly coordinated, as if they were parts of a single organism rather than 4 separate individuals. Most unsettling of all was their apparent ability to influence each other's physical responses. When Dr. Hayes examined one child, the others would react as if they were experiencing the same sensations. A pinprick to Sarah's finger would cause all 4 children to cry out in apparent pain. The isolation of the Whitmore farm meant that few people witnessed the quadruplets' strange behavior firsthand. However, those who did visit the household left with stories that soon spread throughout Barren County. Reverend Thomas Mitchell, who came to bless the children shortly after their birth, later told his congregation that he had never encountered anything quite like the Whitmore girls. They seemed to watch him with understanding that went far beyond their age, and their synchronized movements and vocalizations created an atmosphere that he found deeply disturbing. Mrs. Eleanor Campbell, a midwife who assisted Dr. Hayes during Several visits reported that the children seemed to communicate without words or gestures. She observed them lying in their cribs, staring at each other with intense concentration, after which they would all turn their heads in the same direction or begin moving their limbs in identical patterns. Mrs. Campbell, who had delivered hundreds of babies during her 40 years of practice, confided to Dr. Hayes that she had never seen anything that compared to the eerie unity displayed by the Whitmore quadruplets. As winter settled over Kentucky, Dr. Hayes found himself documenting phenomena that challenged every principle of human development he had learned in medical school. The quadruplets continued to grow and develop in perfect synchronization, but their behavior became increasingly sophisticated in ways that seemed impossible for children their age. They appeared to solve simple problems collectively, with one child beginning an action that the others would complete without apparent communication. Their sleep patterns remained perfectly synchronized, and they seemed to share dreams, often waking at the same moment with identical expressions of distress or contentment. Dr. Hayes began to suspect that he was witnessing something unprecedented in medical history. The Whitmore quadruplets seemed to share not just genetic material and physical characteristics, but consciousness itself. They appeared to function as a single mind distributed across 4 bodies, a phenomenon that had no precedent in medical literature and no explanation within the scientific understanding of his era. The first death occurred on a bitter February morning in 1857, when the quadruplets were 4 months old. Mrs. Agnes Porter, an elderly woman who lived alone on the neighboring property, was found frozen to death in her own kitchen. Despite the fact that her fireplace had been well stocked with wood and her cabin showed no signs of structural damage that would have allowed the cold to penetrate, Dr. Hayes was summoned to examine the body and determine the cause of death, a routine task that would prove to be anything but ordinary. Mrs. Porter had been discovered by her nephew, who had come to check on her after she failed to appear at Sunday church services. The scene that greeted Dr. Hayes was deeply puzzling. The elderly woman sat upright in her kitchen chair, her eyes wide open and staring toward the window that faced the Whitmore property. Her body showed all the signs of death by exposure to extreme cold, yet the cabin's interior temperature was comfortable, and the fire in her hearth had burned down naturally rather than being extinguished by any external force. What disturbed Dr. Hayes most about the scene was Mrs. Porter's expression. Rather than the peaceful look of someone who had simply succumbed to old age or illness, her face was frozen in what could only be described as terror. Her mouth was open as if she had been trying to scream, and her hands were pressed against the kitchen table in a position that suggested she had been attempting to push herself away from something. The window she had been staring toward provided a clear view of the Whitmore farmhouse, and Dr. Hayes found himself wondering what the old woman might have seen in her final moments. Margaret Whitmore had noticed Mrs. Porter's absence from church and mentioned to Dr. Hayes that the elderly woman had seemed increasingly anxious in recent weeks. Mrs. Porter had stopped by the Whitmore farm several times during January, ostensibly to check on the welfare of the quadruplets, but her visits had become shorter and more uncomfortable with each occurrence. Margaret recalled that Mrs. Porter seemed unable to look directly at the children for more than a few seconds at a time, and she often made excuses to leave quickly after arriving. During her final visit to the Whitmore household, Mrs. Porter had pulled Margaret aside and whispered concerns about the children that Margaret found difficult to understand. The elderly woman claimed that the quadruplets made her feel watched, even when they appeared to be sleeping. She spoke of dreams in which 4 identical faces stared at her from her bedroom window, and she mentioned hearing what sounded like synchronized crying coming from the direction of the Whitmore farm during the late hours of the night. Dr. Hayes documented Mrs. Porter's death as resulting from natural causes, primarily because he could find no evidence of violence or external interference. However, the circumstances troubled him enough that he began paying closer attention to the behavior of the Whitmore quadruplets during his regular visits. What he observed over the following weeks would force him to reconsider everything he thought. He understood about the nature of human consciousness and the limits of infant capabilities. The quadruplets had begun exhibiting behaviors that seemed to extend beyond their immediate physical environment. They would often turn their heads in unison toward the windows facing neighboring properties, staring with intense concentration as if observing something that adults could not see. Their synchronized movements became more complex and purposeful, resembling ritualistic patterns rather than random infant activity. Most unsettling was their apparent awareness of events occurring outside their immediate vicinity. On several occasions, the children would become agitated and begin crying at the exact moment when something significant was happening on neighboring farms. When a barn fire broke out at the Henderson property 2 miles away, all 4 quadruplets began crying simultaneously, despite being inside the Whitmore farmhouse with no apparent way of knowing about the distant emergency. When old Mr. Jackson's prize bull broke free from its pen and wandered onto the main road, the children exhibited the same synchronized distress, calming only when the animal was safely returned to its enclosure. Dr. Hayes began to suspect that the quadruplets possessed some form of enhanced sensory capability that allowed them to perceive events at a distance. However, careful observation revealed that their reactions were not simply responses to sounds or other conventional stimuli. The children seemed to be aware of situations that produced no noise and generated no physical signs that could be detected by normal human senses. Their awareness appeared to be connected to emotional disturbances or significant events rather than physical phenomena. The second incident that would challenge Dr. Hayes's understanding of the quadruplets occurred in late March 1857. Young Samuel Patterson, the 7-year-old son of a local farmer, disappeared while playing near the creek that ran between several properties in the area. A search party was organized immediately, with men from surrounding farms combing the woods and waterways for any sign of the missing child. Dr. Hayes joined the search effort, both out of concern for the boy and professional curiosity about how the Whitmore quadruplets might react to such a significant community crisis. The search for Samuel Patterson lasted 3 days, during which the entire community remained on edge. The quadruplets' behavior during this period was unlike anything Dr. Hayes had previously observed. Rather than their usual synchronized crying or restlessness, the children became unnaturally still and focused. They would lie in their cribs for hours without moving, their pale blue eyes fixed on the ceiling as if they were listening to something that no one else could hear. Their breathing became so quiet that Margaret Whitmore checked on them repeatedly to ensure they were still alive. On the second night of the search, Margaret woke to find all 4 children sitting upright in their cribs, something that should have been impossible given their age and physical development. They were staring toward the window that faced the woods where Samuel Patterson had disappeared, their expressions showing an intensity that seemed far beyond their months of life. When Margaret approached their cribs, the children turned to look at her in perfect unison, and for a moment she felt as though she was being examined by something ancient and knowing rather than her own infant daughters. The discovery of Samuel Patterson's body came on the 3rd day, in a location that the search party had already examined twice. The boy was found at the bottom of a deep ravine, approximately half a mile from where he had last been seen playing. The position of his body and the lack of obvious injuries suggested that he had fallen accidentally, possibly while exploring the rocky terrain that characterized the area. Dr. Hayes was called to examine the body and confirm the cause of death, a task that would reveal details that would haunt him for years to come. Samuel Patterson had indeed died from injuries sustained in a fall, but the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that Dr. Hayes found impossible to answer. The boy's body showed signs of having been in the ravine for several days. Yet the search party had thoroughly examined that exact location on the first day of their efforts. More puzzling still was the fact that the boy appeared to have been arranged in a specific position, lying on his back with his arms folded across his chest and his eyes closed as if he had been prepared for burial. The most disturbing aspect of the scene was the presence of 4 small wildflowers placed carefully around Samuel's body, arranged in a perfect square pattern that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The flowers were of a type that grew wild in the Kentucky hills, but they had been picked recently and showed no signs of having been exposed to the weather for the 3 days since Samuel's disappearance. Dr. Hayes recognized the flower arrangement as something he had seen before in the detailed drawings that the Whitmore quadruplets had somehow created using their tiny fingers in the dirt of their play area. The reaction of the quadruplets to Samuel Patterson's death provided Dr. Hayes with evidence that their unusual abilities extended far beyond enhanced sensory perception. The moment that the boy's body was discovered, all 4 children began crying with an intensity that seemed to express genuine grief rather than simple distress. Their synchronized wailing created harmonies that resembled a funeral dirge, and they continued this vocalization for exactly 1 hour before falling into a deep sleep that lasted until the following morning. During the funeral service for Samuel Patterson, held at the small Methodist church that served the rural community, the Whitmore family attended with their quadruplets, as was customary for community members. Dr. Hayes observed the children's behavior throughout the service and noted reactions that seemed inappropriate for their age. While other infants in attendance fussed or slept, the quadruplets remained perfectly still and quiet, their eyes focused on the small coffin with an attention that suggested understanding of the significance of the ceremony. Most unsettling was the moment when Samuel's mother broke down in grief during the pastor's eulogy. At the exact instant that Mrs. Patterson's composure collapsed, all 4 quadruplets turned their heads in unison to stare at her with expressions that seemed to register her emotional state with clinical precision. Dr. Hayes had the distinct impression that the children were studying the woman's grief, cataloging her responses for some purpose that he could not fathom. After the funeral, Dr. Hayes made a decision that would fundamentally alter his approach to studying the Whitmore quadruplets. Rather than simply documenting their unusual behaviors during routine medical visits, he would begin conducting systematic observations designed to test the limits of their apparent abilities. He convinced Jonathan and Margaret Whitmore to allow him to spend periods at their farmhouse, ostensibly to monitor the children's development, but actually to gather evidence of phenomena that he was becoming convinced defied all conventional medical understanding. The experiments that Dr. Hayes began conducting in April 1857 would reveal capabilities in the quadruplets that challenged not only medical science, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of human consciousness and the boundaries between individual minds. What he discovered during those long spring days at the isolated Whitmore farm would force him to confront possibilities that his medical training had never prepared him to consider. The children's apparent ability to perceive events at a distance was just the beginning of mysteries that would ultimately drive Dr. Hayes to question everything he thought he knew about the limits of human potential and the true nature of consciousness itself. Dr. Hayes began his systematic study of the quadruplets in early May 1857, establishing a makeshift laboratory in the spare room of the Whitmore farmhouse. His equipment was primitive by modern standards but represented the most advanced medical instruments available in rural Kentucky during that era. He brought with him a collection of scales, measuring devices, stethoscopes, and detailed charts for recording observations about infant development and behavior patterns. The first controlled experiment involved testing the children's apparent ability to communicate without conventional means. Dr. Hayes separated the quadruplets into different rooms of the farmhouse, ensuring that they could not see or hear each other through normal sensory channels. He then introduced various stimuli to one child while carefully observing the reactions of the other 3. The results exceeded his most optimistic expectations, and challenged every principle of human physiology he had learned during his medical education. When Dr. Hayes gently pinched Sarah's arm in the kitchen, Mary immediately began crying in the bedroom upstairs, despite being completely isolated from any sight or sound of her sister's distress. Elizabeth, placed in the parlor, showed visible signs of discomfort at the exact moment of Sarah's mild pain, rubbing her own arm in the precise location where her sister had been touched. Catherine, situated in the barn with Margaret Whitmore, became suddenly agitated and began reaching toward the farmhouse as if trying to provide comfort to an unseen source of distress. The synchronization was not limited to physical sensations. Dr. Hayes discovered that emotional states were shared among the quadruplets with even greater precision than physical responses. When he made silly faces to entertain Mary, causing her to laugh with delight, her three sisters began smiling and giggling simultaneously, despite being unable to see the source of their siblings' amusement. More remarkably, when he deliberately startled Elizabeth with a sudden loud noise, all four children exhibited identical fear responses within seconds of each other. These initial experiments convinced Dr. Hayes that the quadruplets shared some form of consciousness that transcended individual physical boundaries. However, further testing revealed that their connection extended far beyond simple sensory sharing or emotional synchronization. The children appeared to possess a collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of their individual capabilities, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that seemed impossible for infants their age. Dr. Hayes designed a series of puzzles using common household objects, presenting challenges to the quadruplets that would typically be appropriate for children several years older. When he placed a favorite toy just out of reach of one child, rather than simply crying in frustration as most infants would do, the quadruplets would coordinate their efforts to retrieve the object. One child would distract the adult observers, while another positioned herself strategically, and a third would use her small hands to manipulate the environment in ways that allowed the fourth to reach the desired item. The coordination required for such complex behavior suggested not only shared consciousness, but also advanced planning capabilities that defied accepted understanding of infant cognitive development. Dr. Hayes documented dozens of instances in which the quadruplets demonstrated collective problem-solving skills, collaborative manipulation of their environment, and strategic thinking that would have been impressive in children 3 or 4 times their age. Margaret Whitmore had become increasingly uncomfortable with the children's unusual behaviors, confiding to Dr. Hayes that she sometimes felt as though she was caring for small adults rather than infants. The quadruplets rarely cried for basic needs like food or comfort, instead seeming to anticipate her actions before she performed them. They would position themselves for feeding before she had decided it was mealtime, and they would settle down for sleep before she had prepared their bedtime routine. More unsettling still was their apparent ability to influence the behavior of adults around them. Margaret began experiencing vivid dreams in which the quadruplets appeared as older versions of themselves, speaking to her in voices that seemed both familiar and foreign. These dreams were so realistic that she would often wake believing that actual conversations had taken place, only to find the children sleeping peacefully in their cribs. Jonathan Whitmore reported similar experiences, describing a growing sense that the children were somehow directing his daily activities on the farm. He would find himself drawn to perform specific tasks without remembering why he had decided to do them, often discovering later that his actions had somehow benefited or protected the quadruplets in ways that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Dr. Hayes recognized these reports as potential evidence of the quadruplets' ability to project their influence beyond the immediate sharing of sensations and emotions. He began testing this hypothesis through carefully controlled observations, documenting instances in which the children seemed to manipulate the behavior of adults in their vicinity. The results were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. During one experiment, Dr. Hayes deliberately placed himself in a position where he could not see the quadruplets while they were awake and active. Within minutes, he found himself compelled to turn around and look at them, despite having no conscious reason for doing so. When he repeated this test multiple times, the same irresistible urge to observe the children occurred consistently, suggesting that they were somehow directing his attention through means that bypassed his rational decision-making processes. The quadruplets also demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict future events, particularly those involving death or significant emotional trauma. 3 days before the death of Jonathan's elderly horse, all 4 children became inexplicably agitated, crying in harmonious patterns that seemed to express grief for a loss that had not yet occurred. When the animal finally succumbed to age-related illness, the quadruplets' behavior immediately returned to normal, as if they had been mourning in advance. Similar predictive behaviors occurred before other significant events in the community. The children would become restless and difficult to comfort in the days preceding accidents, illnesses, or deaths among their neighbors, always returning to calm behavior once the anticipated tragedy had occurred. Dr. Hayes began documenting these predictions carefully, noting that the quadruplets' accuracy rate approached 100% for events occurring within a 5-mile radius of their home. The most dramatic demonstration of the children's unusual capabilities occurred during a late spring thunderstorm in June 1857. Dr. Hayes was conducting observations in the parlor when lightning struck a large oak tree near the farmhouse, causing it to crash into the barn where Jonathan was working with the livestock. The impact trapped Jonathan beneath heavy timbers, and his cries for help were barely audible over the continuing thunder and rain. At the exact moment of the accident, all 4 quadruplets began crying with unusual intensity, their vocalizations creating patterns that seemed to echo the rhythm of Jonathan's trapped breathing. Margaret rushed toward the sound of the crash, but before she could organize a rescue effort, the children's cries began forming distinct patterns that seemed to provide specific guidance about where to find her husband and how to free him from the debris. Following the apparent instructions conveyed through the quadruplets' vocalizations, Margaret and Dr. Hayes were able to locate Jonathan quickly and remove the timbers that had pinned him. The precision of the guidance provided by the children was remarkable, as if they possessed detailed knowledge of the accident scene, despite being inside the farmhouse when it occurred. Jonathan suffered only minor injuries, though he would certainly have died if rescue efforts had been delayed by the time typically required to locate someone trapped in such circumstances. Dr. Hayes realized that this incident represented evidence of capabilities that extended far beyond anything he had previously documented. The quadruplets had not only perceived the accident as it happened, but had somehow acquired detailed spatial knowledge of the scene and communicated specific rescue instructions through their coordinated vocalizations. Such abilities suggested forms of consciousness and perception that had no precedent in medical literature and no explanation within accepted scientific understanding. As summer progressed, Dr. Hayes found himself documenting phenomena that challenged not only medical science but fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The quadruplets continued to demonstrate abilities that seemed to violate physical laws, including apparent telepathic communication, precognitive awareness, and influence over the behavior of both humans and animals in their vicinity. The children's influence over animal behavior was particularly pronounced. Farm animals would gather near the Whitmore house when the quadruplets were awake, standing quietly as if drawn by some invisible force. Wild animals that normally avoided human habitation began appearing regularly around the property, showing no fear of the family members but maintaining respectful distances from the children themselves. Birds would often perch on the windowsills of the room where the quadruplets slept, remaining motionless for hours as if standing guard. Dr. Hayes documented instances in which these animal sentinels would become agitated and vocal when strangers approached the property, providing what appeared to be an early warning system that protected the children from unexpected visitors. The psychological impact of caring for such unusual children began taking a toll on both Margaret and Jonathan Whitmore. Margaret reported increasing difficulty sleeping, plagued by dreams in which the quadruplets appeared as adult women who spoke to her about events that had not yet occurred. Jonathan found himself making decisions about farm management that he could not later explain, often discovering that his seemingly irrational choices had prevented accidents or protected the family's livestock from harm. Dr. Hayes recognized that his documentation of the quadruplets' abilities was approaching a critical juncture. The evidence he had gathered would revolutionize understanding of human consciousness and challenge fundamental assumptions about the limits of infant development. However, he was also becoming aware that such revolutionary findings would face intense skepticism from the medical establishment, particularly when the subjects of study were children whose abilities seemed to border on the supernatural. The decision about how to proceed with his research would soon be taken out of Dr. Hayes's hands by events that would demonstrate the true extent of the quadruplets' power and the potential dangers of allowing such abilities to develop without constraint or understanding. The confrontation that would shatter Dr. Hayes's understanding of medical science began on a humid July evening in 1857. He had been documenting the quadruplets' development for 3 months when he made a discovery that forced him to question whether the children were entirely human. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the farmhouse cellar, he found a collection of items that defied rational explanation. Small bones arranged in precise geometric patterns, dried flowers organized according to some unknown system, and most disturbing of all, detailed drawings that appeared to have been created by infant hands, but displayed artistic sophistication far beyond any child's capabilities. The drawings depicted scenes from the community's recent tragedies with accuracy that could only have come from direct observation. Mrs. Porter's final moments were rendered in meticulous detail, showing her terror-stricken face and the exact position of her body in the kitchen chair. Samuel Patterson's death was illustrated with anatomical precision that would have impressed medical school professors, complete with accurate depictions of the internal injuries that had caused his death. Each drawing was signed with 4 tiny handprints arranged in a perfect square, the same pattern that had appeared around Samuel's body in the ravine. Dr. Hayes realized that the quadruplets had been documenting their experiences through means that should have been impossible for children their age. More alarming still was the discovery of drawings that depicted future events, including detailed illustrations of accidents and deaths that had not yet occurred but showed people Dr. Hayes recognized from the surrounding community. One drawing showed Reverend Mitchell falling from his church's bell tower, another depicted Mrs. Campbell drowning in the creek near her home, and a third illustrated a fire consuming the Henderson family's barn, with the entire family trapped inside. When Dr. Hayes confronted Margaret and Jonathan about these discoveries, their responses revealed that they had been living in terror of their own children for months. Margaret admitted that she had found similar drawings hidden throughout the house, always depicting scenes of death and suffering with disturbing accuracy. Jonathan confessed that he had begun sleeping in the barn rather than the farmhouse, unable to bear the sensation of being constantly watched and evaluated by 4 pairs of pale blue eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. The truth about the quadruplets' nature became fully apparent during a violent thunderstorm on the night of July 22nd. Dr. Hayes was spending the evening at the farmhouse to continue his observations when lightning struck the property with unusual frequency and intensity. Rather than seeking comfort from their parents, as normal children would during such frightening weather, the quadruplets became extraordinarily active and alert, their synchronized movements taking on ritualistic qualities that suggested purpose, rather than random infant behavior. As the storm intensified, The children began vocalizing in harmonious patterns that seemed to echo and amplify the thunder overhead. Their pale eyes reflected the lightning flashes with a luminescence that appeared almost supernatural, and their small bodies moved in perfect coordination, as if performing a ceremony that they had practiced for far longer than their few months of life. Dr. Hayes observed with growing horror as the quadruplets seemed to be directing the storm's energy towards specific targets in the surrounding community. Lightning struck the Henderson farm with devastating precision, igniting the exact fire that had been depicted in one of the hidden drawings. The bolt that hit Reverend Mitchell's church tower sent him plummeting to his death in the precise manner that the quadruplets had illustrated weeks earlier. Mrs. Campbell's body was found the following morning, drowned in the creek, exactly as the children had predicted through their disturbing artwork. Each tragedy occurred with timing and circumstances that matched the quadruplets' prophetic drawings with terrifying accuracy. Dr. Hayes realized that the children were not simply predicting future events, but actively causing them through means that transcended any known form of human capability. The quadruplets possessed powers that allowed them to manipulate natural forces and influence events at a distance, using their collective consciousness as a weapon against anyone who had earned their displeasure or served their unknown purposes. The innocent appearance of 4 helpless infants concealed minds that operated according to logic and motivations that bore no resemblance to normal human thought processes. The final confrontation occurred when Dr. Hayes attempted to remove his research notes and drawings from the farmhouse, intending to seek help from medical colleagues in Louisville who might understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. As he gathered his materials in the early morning hours, believing the quadruplets to be asleep, he found himself surrounded by 4 small figures who had somehow freed themselves from their cribs and moved silently through the house to intercept him. The children stood in a perfect square formation, their pale blue eyes reflecting the dawn light with an intensity that seemed to pierce directly into Dr. Hayes's mind. Without speaking or making any audible sound, they communicated their displeasure with his plans through direct mental contact that overwhelmed his consciousness with images and sensations beyond human comprehension. He experienced visions of cosmic forces and alien intelligences that used the quadruplets' bodies as vessels for purposes that had nothing to do with human welfare or understanding. In that moment of terrifying clarity, Dr. Hayes understood that the Whitmore quadruplets were not unusual human children, but something far more dangerous and otherworldly. They were conduits for entities or forces that existed beyond normal reality, using their innocent appearance to establish themselves within human society, while pursuing goals that remained incomprehensible to conventional human thinking. Their abilities were not anomalies of human development, but expressions of power that originated from sources that medical science had never encountered and was not equipped to understand. The mental contact lasted only seconds in objective time, but it conveyed information that would haunt Dr. Hayes for the remainder of his life. He learned that the quadruplets' true purpose involved the systematic elimination of specific individuals whose deaths would serve larger patterns that extended far beyond the immediate community. He saw visions of similar births occurring throughout history, always producing children who appeared normal, but possessed abilities that allowed them to reshape human events according to designs that served non-human intelligences. When the communication ended, Dr. Hayes found himself alone in the farmhouse with his research materials scattered around him and no memory of how the quadruplets had returned to their cribs. Margaret and Jonathan Whitmore lay sleeping peacefully in their bedroom, apparently unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The children appeared to be ordinary infants once again, but Dr. Hayes knew that he had glimpsed their true nature and that his life would never be the same. Dr. Hayes never published his research on the Whitmore quadruplets. 3 days after his final encounter with the children, he packed his medical equipment and fled Kentucky without explanation. abandoning his practice and leaving behind the most comprehensive documentation of supernatural abilities ever recorded by a trained physician. His sudden departure sparked rumors throughout Barren County, but no one suspected the terrifying truth behind his hasty retreat from what had promised to be a groundbreaking medical discovery. The quadruplets disappeared exactly 1 week after Dr. Hayes's departure. Margaret Whitmore woke on the morning of August 15, 1857, to find 4 empty cribs and no trace of her daughters anywhere on the property. No signs of struggle marked the scene, no footprints led away from the farmhouse, and no evidence suggested that anyone had entered or left the building during the night. The children had simply vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. Jonathan and Margaret Whitmore never spoke publicly about what had happened to their daughters. When questioned by concerned neighbors and local authorities, they claimed to have no memory of events surrounding the children's disappearance. They appeared genuinely confused when asked about details of the quadruplets' development or the circumstances that had brought Dr. Hayes to spend so much time studying them. Their minds had been wiped clean of memories that might have revealed the true nature of what they had been raising in their isolated farmhouse. The Whitmore farm was abandoned within 6 months of the children's disappearance. Both Jonathan and Margaret developed mysterious illnesses that no physician could diagnose or treat effectively. They aged rapidly, as if the stress of their experience had accelerated the natural processes of physical deterioration. Margaret died in the spring of 1858, followed by Jonathan just 3 months later. Neither lived long enough to provide any final testimony about the supernatural events that had transformed their lives. Dr. Hayes attempted to resume his medical practice in Ohio, but his experiences in Kentucky had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. His colleagues noticed dramatic changes in his personality and approach to medicine. He became obsessed with documenting unusual births and infant abnormalities, traveling throughout the Midwest to investigate reports of children who displayed capabilities beyond normal human development. His private journals from this period reveal a man desperately searching for evidence that the Whitmore quadruplets were not unique phenomena. The research notes and drawings that Dr. Hayes had gathered during his study of the quadruplets were never recovered. He claimed that all physical evidence of his discoveries had been destroyed by forces beyond his control, leaving only his personal testimony to support claims that seemed too extraordinary for any reasonable person to accept. The medical establishment dismissed his stories as symptoms of mental breakdown brought on by the isolation and stress of rural practice. In 1863, Dr. Hayes was found dead in his Ohio clinic under circumstances that investigators deemed suspicious, but could never adequately explain. His body showed no signs of violence or illness, yet his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror that witnesses described as haunting. Among his personal effects, investigators discovered fragments of drawings that appeared to depict 4 identical young girls, now grown to adolescence, standing over the body of a middle-aged man who bore unmistakable resemblance to Dr. Hayes himself. The truth about the Whitmore quadruplets remains buried in sealed archives that no modern researcher has been permitted to examine. Official records from Barren County during 1856 and 1857 have disappeared from government repositories, and church records from the period show mysterious gaps where entries about multiple births should have been documented. The systematic erasure of evidence suggests deliberate intervention by agencies or organizations with both the motivation and capability to suppress information about supernatural phenomena. Contemporary reports of similar incidents continue to surface occasionally in remote areas throughout the world. Medical professionals working in isolated communities sometimes encounter multiple births that display unusual synchronization and capabilities that challenge accepted understanding of human development. These cases are invariably suppressed or explained away through conventional means, ensuring that the public never learns about phenomena that might fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of consciousness and reality. The legacy of the Whitmore quadruplets serves as a reminder that the boundaries between normal and supernatural may be far more permeable than modern science acknowledges. In an age that prides itself on rational explanation and scientific understanding, there remain mysteries that defy conventional analysis and forces that operate according to rules that human intelligence may never fully comprehend. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.